Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 36 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 6-2. This is the Sharks' third game this season versus Vancouver, and also their third lost this season versus the Canucks. Now, at the very least, however, the first couple of games did come in overtime. In both of those games, it felt as though the Sharks were, potentially at the very least, the better team and could have come out with the extra point there, but just unfortunately losing in the post-regulation time. But here tonight, this game did not go to overtime. It was not even particularly close to going to overtime. The Sharks were clearly the worst team here, and they lose it by an absolute spanking at the hands of the Vancouver Canucks of 6-2, and this is a pretty disappointing loss for the San Jose Sharks. They went into that Christmas break with some pretty good vibes, having managed to take down the Minnesota Wild and in relatively dominant fashion, and so it was maybe a thought that the Sharks could have, a somewhat brighter future moving on past that holiday break, past that sort of recharging point of the season, but that clearly does not end up being the case. Yes, the Sharks did have to travel and then play a game on that very same day. That's relatively tough to do, but still, it is no excuse for how the Sharks actually ended up playing here tonight, which was genuinely quite awful from much of the team. Not all of the team, I should mention. There were a few select players who actually had really good games, but pretty much everybody else was just lagging behind severely. Now let's start off in the first period, where the Canucks do score the first and second goals of this game to take themselves a 2-0 lead. This happens relatively early on, I guess. However, as we move on to the last minute or so of the first period, the Sharks get a power play and manage to score a Timo Meier goal, his 19th of the season, to make it 2-1. And so the Sharks are only trailing by one goal heading into the second period. And it was somewhat understandable that the Sharks would come out somewhat sluggish in the first period because of the aforementioned sort of traveling situation that they had on this particular day. But you would hoping that that would kind of ramp up as the game would move on, and they would be more ready to play in the second and then of course the subsequent third period after that. But that didn't end up being the case. In the second period, the Sharks wouldn't even be able to get a single goal, and they would still give up another 2 to Vancouver, and that would make it a 4-1 game at the end of that middle frame. And so going into the third period, the Sharks were trailing by 3 goals, and we have seen at times some pretty solid comebacks this season from San Jose, or at the very least they've made games interesting in the third period, but down by 3 goals is a step too far. The Sharks, they get some good chances. There are a couple of good saves made by the goaltender for the Canucks, Spencer Martin, but realistically, this game doesn't really come all that close to ever actually being close. And in the end, it is Horvat who scores to make it 5-2, or make it 5-1. Then Meier scores his 20th of the season to make it 5-2. And eventually, it is Besser who scores not even on the empty net, but with about 2.5 minutes later to make an even more embarrassing loss for the San Jose Sharks to lose it 6-2. Now, having said that it was an embarrassing loss, it at the very least wasn't at the same level, I feel, as the loss to the Calgary Flames a few days ago when they just got absolutely destroyed 7-3, but still a 6-2 loss here tonight. Definitely not good at all, especially in comparison to the previous game they played, like I mentioned, against the Minnesota Wild. Now, moving on to the players to talk about, we have this first line, and even though Hertl does return from injury, or from suspension, I should say, for this game, David Quinn decides to actually keep this top line of Meier, Couture, and Barabanov together. Obviously, they had had very good success those couple of games while Hertl was suspended, and Quinn decides to continue to try and load up that first line. Now, technically, just looking at this first line in a vacuum, this definitely worked out. This was by far the Sharks' best line of the game. In fact, it was the Sharks' only really good line of the game at all, and much of this game actually indeed felt as though it was Canucks. Oh, the Timo Meier line is on, they'll get a couple of chances. Canucks. Oh, the Timo Meier line is on, they'll get a couple of chances. And then essentially just a repeating pattern of exactly that. This line, every single time it stepped on the ice, they seemed to be getting good offensive zone time, solid chances, and actually forechecking rather well, not just the one and done type of off the rush situation chances. Meier had just an absolutely fantastic game here tonight. I thought Barabanov also was very, very good. Couture, I felt as though, was the weakest link on this top line, but even having said that, he was still probably the Sharks' third best forward in this particular game. Just a very, very solid game from this first line. But like I mentioned earlier, the sort of bad side of loading up this first line is that the Sharks basically have nobody else on the roster to actually generate all that much offense on a consistent basis besides the returning suspended player, Tomas Hertl, here on the second line, where he finds himself centering LeBanc and Bonino. But with Barabanov, Couture, and Meier on the first line, you have Hertl and then 8 other players who, on an actual decent to good team, would probably at best be a fourth liner. LeBanc is arguable. We have seen at times this season him show himself to be somewhat of a top 6 player, but realistically, at least with the 7 other players besides Hertl and LeBanc, they're all pretty much just capped out as fourth line players, and yet the Sharks have to run multiple in their top 6, and it's just absolutely disastrous here tonight against Vancouver. There's just not really any sort of consistency at all from their bottom 3 lines. I thought Hertl was okay in his return, but still not really driving force on this second line. LeBanc, I also thought, was pretty decent, but not that great, and not really sort of making up for the general lack of offense from anything past the top line. And then they were joined by Nick Bonino on the second line, who continues to not really do much of anything. He did indeed have a couple of good games when he was just randomly placed into this top 6, because the Sharks do not have many other options on their main roster currently to fill in into these particular roles. But it is definitely a sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing type of situation here for Nick Bonino. He does not belong in the top 6. That much is evident to everyone except David Quinn. And it's pretty much a situation where the Sharks can't necessarily expect all that much here with this sort of lineup continuing at this point. When it comes to the third line of Gregor, Sturm, and Nieto, I thought this line did get a couple of okay chances, but unlike that first line where I mentioned much of it was off the forecheck, good offensive zone time, the only actual chances that this Gregor and Sturm line actually that managed to get were those off the rush chances. We saw Gregor get one, we saw Sturm get one, it was okay, but realistically, in terms of actual sort of where did they play much of this game, it was mostly in the defensive zone, mostly disastrous. It was one of those Gregor games where the coin flip does not land on heads, it lands on tails, and so he's basically, besides that 1 or 2 chances that he did get, he's basically invisible and not really doing much for them. Nieto gets dropped from the second line to the third line due to the introduction of Hertl back into the lineup after suspension. He doesn't really do anything in this situation, which again is not a surprise. Just because he found himself on the second line many times this season doesn't mean he's actually a second liner. So even on the third line, which should realistically be an easier role, it's not as though he's going to light things up. And then when it comes to the fourth line of Lorentz, Lindblom, and Svechnikov, obviously with Hertl coming back into the lineup, someone does have to step out, and that was Gadjevich. I do agree with that healthy scratch, especially since, Lorentz has been really good these past few games, and Lindblom had a very solid performance against the Minnesota Wild, so Gadjevich definitely seemed to be the odd man out. Svechnikov gets moved down from the third line to the fourth line, and I thought this fourth line, not terrible. I thought Lindblom had a couple of decent plays. I thought Lorentz had a couple of decent plays. I thought Svechnikov had a couple of decent plays. But again, unless they're just having like the game of their lives and actually contributing pretty significantly in the offensive zone and on the score sheet, this fourth line isn't really going to move the dial in any which direction, move the meter in any which direction here for the San Jose Sharks. They're just sort of there, and you're hoping that they're going to give a somewhat positive performance, and they did do that sort of here tonight, but clearly that's not really a difference maker. When it comes to the defensive side of things, if we take a look at the usual suspect here, Erik Karlsson, a game that was definitely not as good as his performance against the Minnesota Wild, but also definitely not as bad as his performance in the game prior to that one against the Calgary Flames. I thought he was kind of right down the middle there. Obviously had a couple of very nice plays that led to the Sharks' only 2 goals in this one. The nice slap pass that led to the Meier power play goal, and he sort of just waltzes into the zone and easily feeds this pass to Timo Meier for his second goal of that game. But besides that, and a couple of other okay offensive plays, there wasn't anything super consistent offensively from Erik Karlsson. And then on the defensive side of things, definitely some awkward situations here where he did not look particularly good. We take a look at the Pettersson goal that made it 2-0 for Vancouver. That's definitely one that stands out as a pretty bad one for Erik Karlsson, who is not only just completely leaving Pettersson alone in front of the net, but off of this rebound when James Reimer is trying to find this puck and sort of scrambling to make the save, Erik Karlsson barely gives him any help in this situation, which allows Pettersson to eventually push this puck past Reimer. So generally, it was a not great defensive game, pretty bad defensive game from Erik Karlsson, but also a pretty decent offensive game from him. So it's kind of just a classic Erik Karlsson game, which is something I've said many times in the past thus far this season, and really just ever since he's been on the San Jose Sharks. We saw on the second pairing, Benning did leave with an injury at a point, I believe ended up returning to the game in the third period. This is, maybe a few weeks ago I would have said this was a decent loss for the San Jose Sharks, but as of late, these past couple of weeks, Benning has looked quite bad, similar to how he looked back in the very early parts of this season. So I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world. At the moment, the Sharks do technically have 7 capable NHL defensemen at this point on their rosters. Shemek has been a healthy scratch these past couple of games because of the returning Mario Ferraro to the lineup and the fact that Harrington has outperformed Shemek. So having Benning, if he is injured, if he can't play, whatever the situation is there, we did see him return, like I said, so it's very possible he's just completely healthy and nothing is going to be written about this. But Shemek definitely could fill into the lineup. Having said that, this second pairing was not particularly good here tonight, even prior to the Benning injury, and generally has just not been that great besides that one blip in the Minnesota game. And then finally, I do want to talk about James Reimer. A very rough performance for him here tonight. Obviously, he lets in 6 goals. As I've said in the past, no matter how many shots you faced and how many difficult goals and situations you were put in, letting in 6 goals is never really going to reflect well on you as a goaltender. And if we take a look at a couple of these goals, he definitely had the chance to make the save on a few of them, and it just didn't really end up happening. For instance, if we take a look at the first Horvat goal, don't think he had too much of a chance. This was a difficult puck to spot and a very nice zero angle opportunity from Horvat. Didn't have too much of a chance on the Pettersson one, but the Mikheyev one, it felt as though he had more time to get across and just couldn't do so. It felt as though he wasn't playing the correct angle on the Quinn Hughes goal. He definitely could have made the save on the second Bo Horvat one. He probably could have made the save, though it didn't really matter at this point, on the Brock Besser goal as well. So not a good game really for James Reimer, who had started this season off rather well. It looked like he would be very solid trade bait by the trade deadline for the San Jose Sharks, but over this past month and a half, his game has kind of trended downwards, and it's going to be more and more difficult as these types of games continue to add up for the Sharks to actually move on from Reimer and get even relatively decent value for him. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action. They'll be on Thursday, and at this point, it's really difficult to predict what to expect from San Jose. Will we see the team that went up against the Minnesota Wild and played really well, or will we see the team that played against the Canucks and played twice against the Calgary Flames and just looked completely awful? Who knows? Class dismissed.